So you're wanting to move to Europe because OMG, free healthcare. And also, everything is so safe and clean and the streets are just amazing. All of the buildings are so old, but they're taken care of. I'm going to be the first to tell you that what you see online isn't always the daily reality that you will experience. But rather than going off on a tangent, let's just go straight into the episode. So roll that intro. Hello there, I'm Rafael Di Furia, and welcome back to another episode of Not Your Average Globetrotter. This week, like I mentioned in the intro to this episode, I want to talk about some of the realities of living in Europe and some of the things to expect. Is it really as wonderful as they say it is? Is it worthwhile to actually live in Europe? And I will say, actually, before I get started, there are going to be many things that will sound as though I'm going to say that are very negative and maybe saying don't move to Europe, but I'm not saying don't move. I'm just saying these are some realities that you may want to take into consideration. Also, I will be talking mostly about Central, Northern, and Western Europe. A little bit of Southern Europe is included in this Western part that I'm talking about, but basically, even though some people consider Poland and Czechia or the Czech Republic to be part of Central Europe, I'm really more so talking about, say, from Austria, Switzerland, Germany, and over and north and south from there. So basically Sweden, Finland, Denmark, Germany, Austria, Switzerland, Italy, and over. And of course, because it's 2023, please keep in mind there are going to be some gross generalizations in this episode, but I think some of them do fit and should be taken in consideration regardless of what country you are thinking about moving to. But let's start with one of the first things that I mentioned in the intro. Free healthcare. OMG, it's amazing. Let's think about that for a second. You will often have access to healthcare, but it's not free. It is touted around the world in online articles as free access to healthcare, socialized medicine, and this and that. And so for people who are maybe especially coming from a place like the US where healthcare is not socialized overall for everybody, there are going to be some aspects that aren't exactly as they are sold online or in the media. While you may have low cost or free access to healthcare in many countries, one of the biggest caveats to that is taxes and social contributions are actually going to be a bit on the high side, even when you're in Southern Europe. And actually in Europe is going to probably be one of the parts of the world where you're going to find higher personal income taxes, as well as even potentially, if you're opening up a business, higher corporate taxes, or even if you're registered as a freelancer. There are going to be things that may seem advantageous from the outside, but when you look at them a little bit deeper, you could find better in other parts of the world. Again, I do call Europe home, and there are certain reasons why I do enjoy living here. But again, getting back to the medical systems, it's going to highly depend on what country you're in and where specifically you are within that country. I mean, even let's talk about Italy as an example. From the north to the south, there can be a large difference between the quality of care that you may receive. And there was a story about a number of years ago in, I believe it was Calabria or Puglia, that in some hospitals or medical centers, they didn't have the materials to create casts for individuals who had broken bones. And I saw photos, and I can't confirm this, but it was a story that went around and it went through the news. But like I said, I'm not able to confirm this, but there were pictures that went around of people going to the doctor and just being wrapped up with medical tape and popsicle sticks. Like, that's something to take into consideration, not that that's going to be the norm. Also, there are other aspects. So, for example, when you are going to a public hospital or you're going to a public doctor, very often, because this is a public office, you're going to be going to a doctor with all the joys and wonders of visiting the Department of Motor Vehicles. Insert rainbow right here. And in general, there is a lot of bureaucracy across Europe. I mean, in my personal opinion, bureaucracy and Europe go hand in hand. I mean, even if you look at Switzerland, if you watch, there's a YouTuber named Tom Scott. He recently uploaded an episode of his series, and there's a town that is a ski resort where they basically banned cars many years ago, but the vehicles that they do have available are electric. However, even though they do have these electric vehicles, you are not personally allowed to own one for only private usage. You have to be having it for a taxi or for deliveries, and then even then you have to apply for permission every 3 years to be able to continue your activities. But even also, I will say that I have heard stories, and I'm not going to say where this story was specifically. I don't believe I've ever mentioned this on Not Your Average Globetrotter before, but I remember very specifically reading a newspaper about a story of an elderly individual who was at the hospital in his area, and it happened to be the big hospital for his district. And this individual was unable to walk on their own and had been brought to the hospital late at night and was put into a hospital bed in just the hallway, just so that he would be waiting there. If I remember correctly, in the end, he basically spent the whole night waiting there to be seen. But apparently throughout the night, he had been shouting for help because, again, he was unable to move himself or take care of himself. And I won't go into detail here, but he ended up in a pile of his own. He needed to use the services there, and nobody was able to help him. And none of the hospital staff paid attention to him. So without going into the details, I hope you can understand where I'm going with that. But to be completely fair, unlike some parts of the world, when you are living in Europe, for the most part, if you are a legal resident, it's not a question about if you will be seen, it's more about when you will be seen. And yes, even though you will have public systems, you will also have private healthcare as well. Although in a place like Portugal, for example, even in the private hospitals here in the city where I live, they do recommend, if you have a drastic emergency, to go to the public hospital because they're better equipped to handle it. So that's just something I would say is very interesting to consider. Just before I get into the next point, I want to say a huge thank you to those of you who helped to make Not Your Average Globetrotter possible and keep this project going through the one-time donations, such as the thanks button here on YouTube, as well as the monthly support through Patreon. Really, again, thank you so very much. And just to continue on, like I was mentioning about the bureaucracy across Europe, I mean, there are going to be many aspects which you will never interact with on a daily basis, but there are some, depending on where you are, that may come into your life. I mean, this example that I talked about in the Tom Scott video earlier, that's going to be an extreme for Switzerland. They're not part of the European Union, but they are in Europe. But you do find in Switzerland and a number of other countries that they have a lot of rules and regulations about various parts of life. Even I believe in Switzerland, they have rules about like how late you can have your TV on or the type of noise that you can make after like maybe 10 p.m. Of course, there are going to be sound ordinance laws across the world, but when you are living in a lot of European apartments, the walls are going to be very thin and you will hear things. I mean, regardless of whether you're in an apartment or a standalone home, I mean, the way that things are built in this part of the world tends to be a little bit different than what you might be accustomed to in North America, for example. And I'm not saying, for example, if you're in an apartment in the US that you won't hear your neighbors, but there are places that I've lived where you can hear things very detailed, like very detailed conversations. And then also, some people want to live the wonderful, glamorous European life, living in a small town, living on the narrow alleyways and just walking everywhere. I mean, the walking everywhere thing I'm definitely into. But I remember living in one place specifically on a small little alleyway that was idyllic and people would walk down it and, oh, just so wonderful. But when you lived there, because of how close the buildings were and everybody would keep their windows open in the warm weather, you could hear every conversation echoing down this little alleyway. And especially when it came to days like Saturday, you could tell what families were at home having fun, what couples got along, what couples didn't get along, and then, to put it nicely, what couples really got along. Every little detail. That's all I'm saying. As another quick example, and it's something I've also mentioned in Not Your Average Globetrotter before, is about how in Italy that when you are at a store, whether it's a cafe or something even very simple where you aren't actually taking the item out with you, you've already consumed it in the store, you are supposed to keep the receipt with you. I mean, that's something very interesting to me that theoretically you could get in trouble, not that people really do, but you're supposed to. And another area for those of you who maybe aren't drivers or are thinking about getting your license for the first time or have let your license lapse over and will have to get your quote unquote first license in a European nation and won't be able to transfer from your home country, then you will have to consider that in most, if not all of the European countries, you will have to have driving lessons. It's not like in the US where you can just go to a parking lot and learn there and then go take the theoretical test and then the driving test, and having just basically studied on your own. You are obliged to sign up for a driving school. And depending on where you are in the European Union, of course, this could be quite pricey. I remember some Italian friends of mine complaining about it being in the thousands of euros. And here in Portugal, I've looked and seen prices between, say, for kind of basic licensing, between 8 and 1,200, depending on if they will offer you a translator if you want to do it in English or not. That's another factor, that in some places like Italy, for example, you can't take the test in English. You can only really do it in Italian. I think there's a couple other languages, but I don't remember what they are off the top of my head. And then also, even for voting, for those of you who are interested in being politically active, in a lot of places, you don't vote for your prime minister directly. You vote for the party. And theoretically, the party at any moment could choose to not move forward with their candidate that they've been campaigning with. But I wouldn't say that's something you should normally even really worry about. But there's that theoretical possibility that the person who's been campaigning, who you've been really excited about, might not actually be the person who gets in. And then even if you vote, because many countries are multi-party systems that have to get a majority one way or the other, there will often have to be coalitions to actually get that majority and combining together to get a greater stance. So maybe the person who you voted for might not even if their party won, might not actually even end up as the prime minister of the country that you voted in. But then also there's another little aspect that when it comes to the European Union as a whole, there's a governing body. Who votes for them? It's not the people. Having been raised in a very different part of the world and spending my adult life outside of it, I can see things from both the American and maybe slightly more European view, but there are times when a lack of direct elections is like something that makes me think for a second, that's definitely interesting. But something else that I do quickly want to touch on that I mentioned earlier on in the episode is about the wonderful, glamorous, Instagrammable moments, the pretty people in the pretty places doing the very pretty things. And really, at the end of the day, you're not necessarily getting the full picture. And whether the pun was intended or not, I'll leave that one up to you. But like I said, you're not getting the full picture of what things actually can be like. I mean, some of those Instagrammable moments that you do see online in articles and on Instagram, for example, or Facebook, whatever it may be, those pretty moments, those can be very doctored, or showing a particular moment at like 5 a.m, showing this idyllic place, but then a few minutes later, it gets completely packed and crowded with tourists. Or if you slightly turn the camera, maybe it's a great view, but then everybody else is getting the same great view and it's just a line of tourists. Or maybe there's a line of tourists waiting behind you to get the same idyllic picture that you just got. A lot of people I know from the US often talk about, the pretty old buildings, and it's amazing how they're just still in use and this and that, but it's like everywhere else. You're going to have buildings that are falling apart. You're going to have places that are not taken care of. Not every European location is idyllic. And even within some of the most major European cities, while you can have beautiful parts of them, even one block to the next might not be perfect. And to be perfectly frank, many European cities are dirty. And I'm not saying that other cities in other parts of the world aren't, but just, you got to be realistic. And I'm not saying that every European city is. There are many clean places that you can go. However, even some of the cleanest places still have the dirty little nooks and crannies that don't get paid attention to. It's very difficult to generalize when you're talking about a continent with many different countries, with many different peoples, many different languages, and many different cultures, sometimes even within the same country. But there are some aspects of life that I think get overlooked when people are thinking about moving to Europe, especially those who've been on a vacation to Europe and they've had their wonderful, amazing little time, but they have lived within the bubble of that vacation. So anyway, this is where I'm going to round things off. Thank you so much for joining me for another episode of Not Your Average Globetrotter. A huge thank you to those of you who helped support this project through Patreon, the one-time donations like the thanks button, and rafaeldifuria.com/support. I'm Rafael Di Furia. Stay safe and healthy out there, and I will see you all next time. Later.